you. Good morning. My name is Karen Littlewood. I'm the president of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, a federation of more than 60,000 hardworking and passionate secondary school teachers and education workers in elementary and secondary public schools across Ontario. I stand before you today with a sense of urgency. Our education system, which should be a sanctuary for learning, self-exploration, and personal growth, is facing a growing crisis that demands our immediate attention. We've been hearing for years the violence in classrooms and schools was on the rise, and more members were facing threats, intimidation, and experiencing acts of violence in the workplace. We repeatedly reached out to the Ford government to work with us on solutions, but our calls remained largely unanswered, even as more and more reports came out, directly linking Ford's cuts to education funding with the staffing crisis in education and increasing violence in schools. Last year, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario shared that 77% of their members reported they have personally experienced violence or witnessed violence against another staff member. And earlier this year, People for Education reported on the growing staffing crisis in education due to underfunding. Principals reported that staffing is the number one issue they face every single day. And we know the recruitment and retention crisis in education is directly contributing to the increase in violence in schools. We waited for data from the Ministry of Labor's Workplace Violence Inspection Blitz of education worksites conducted in February and March of 2023, for example, and the data has still not been released. We only got one response from the Ford government over all this time. Minister Lecce took the opportunity to repeat the misleading claim that this government has made the biggest investments ever in education. We all know that's not true, and that they have actually cut funding by about $1,500 per student since 2018. Minister didn't acknowledge that workplace violence reports remain high or that the staffing crisis is fueling the increase in violence in schools. It was just one more big statement full of false promises with zero results. So we took the matter into our own hands to find out what's really going on in Ontario schools. OSSTF FEESO conducted a survey of our members on their experiences with workplace violence in the 2022-2023 school year and the beginning of the 2023-2024 school year. And the results of this research were staggering, but not at all surprising to members who know firsthand that violence is an increasing concern in Ontario schools. Far too many OSSTF FEESO members, particularly women, have witnessed or experienced violence within their school buildings. 2 in 5 members witnessed an attempt of physical force against another staff person. The data rises to 78% among child and youth workers, 73% for education assistants, and 62% among early childhood educators. 1/3 of permanent teachers witnessed an attempt of physical force against another staff person. These are not just statistics. It's a stark reflection of the reality facing education workers and teachers every single day in Ontario. I will now turn it over to Don Hoffman, a lead researcher on this survey, to share further details on the results.
Thank you. Hello. I'm going to speak a little bit to the methodology, and then I'm going to get into some of the results. Some of those results you have just heard, but I'm going to reiterate them among other statistics. Stratcom conducted an online survey of OSSTF FEESO members. Over 6,500 members responded in May and June of 2023, so the previous school year. That survey was then supplemented with focus groups with members so that we can hear in members' own words about their experiences with violence, not just violence that is levied at educators and education workers, but also what it is like to witness violence between students in school buildings and in the classroom. And the results were stark. I would like to remind you at this time that Education staff comprise many job functions so that when we are speaking to the results, we are speaking not just to the experiences of permanent teachers and occasional teachers. We are speaking to the support staff that work closely with our students on a daily basis. We are speaking to educational assistants, early childhood educators, child and youth workers, behaviorists, social workers, guidance counselors, and a number of other professions covering the whole school ecosystem. When I present the data, I am speaking to OSSTF FEESO's members exclusively in the K-12 public education system. So what did we hear? Violence against teachers and education workers is a critical and growing issue in our schools, and it adversely impacts the well-being of entire school communities, student learning, and professional retention. The incidence and severity of violence against teachers and education workers has increased since before March 2020, but over the entirety of members' careers as well. And I say that because the pandemic may have accelerated, it may have exacerbated the problem of violence in Ontario schools, but it is not the root cause. Some data points. 7 in 10 members, 69%, say the number of incidents of violence against teachers and educators in Ontario's public schools has increased since before March 2020. 75% of members say there are more incidents of violence since they began working in Ontario's public schools. 60% say the severity of that violence has increased as well. So what do we mean when we're talking about violence? Violence can take many forms. It is psychological and it is physical. Both cannot be dismissed. Psychological violence, which occurs regularly for teachers and education staff in our secondary schools, largely occurs in the form of verbal abuse, bullying, and harassment by students. Verbal abuse includes not just the daily levying of misogynistic or offensive language, but actual threats to educators' physical safety. Physical violence, when it is aimed at our educators and our education workers, includes biting, hitting, kicking, and the use of physical objects and furniture to inflict harm. Violence has resulted in a range of injuries to our staff, some with short-term consequences, some with much longer-term or even lifelong consequences. So what are the numbers telling us? 36% of OSSTF FEESO members witnessed the use of physical force, physical violence against another staff person in the 2022-2023 school year. 31% of members report having personally had physical force used against them. Personal experiences with physical violence are widespread and higher among professions serving Ontario's highest need students. 75% of educational assistants had physical force used against them, as well as 70% of child and youth workers, 63% of early childhood educators, and 16% of permanent teachers in our schools. What else is the data showing? The risk is greater for women in our schools. Female members experience violence at the workplace in greater numbers than their male counterparts. 35% of female members overall across job functions were personally subjected to physical force compared to 20% of male members. Again, 3/4 of educational assistants report having had physical force used against them in the 2022-2023 school year. 89% of educational assistants identify as female. What else are we hearing from members? Accountability measures are lacking in schools. What does accountability look like when it comes to workplace violence? It takes many different forms. It is how we fund or do not fund our schools. It is our class sizes. It is staffing and resources for students in crisis. And yes, it is measures that hold students accountable in appropriate ways. During their time in the public school system, members report that those accountability measures, those resources that would prevent and decrease the incidence of violence in our schools, have decreased over time. 69% of members report that in-class supports, and that is our staff like educational assistants and other support personnel, have decreased in number and availability over their time with the schools. 49% say in-school support, so that's the availability of staff support such as child and youth workers, guidance counselors, among others, have also decreased over their time in Ontario's public schools. We also asked members when staffing supports were needed for students, how often those were available. So when we look at the population of members who say that those supports were needed, so people who actually needed to access them on behalf of their students, the numbers are woefully lacking. 34% say child and youth workers were always available or available most of the time when needed. So that would mean 66% said they were only available some of the time, rarely, or never. 47% say educational assistants were always available or available most of the time when needed. Again, that means more than half would say that they were only sometimes available, rarely, or never available for students when needed. That number drops to 11% when it came to behavioral specialists in schools. OSSTF FEESO has been highlighting data that has been publicly available for some time around the shortages of qualified staff in our schools. School systems and districts are struggling to recruit and retain not just educators, but again, a range of education workers that support our students, and particularly our students in need. The issue of workplace violence is exacerbating already untenable working conditions and schools' ability to recruit and retain qualified staff. And so this is what we're hearing from members. So in their words, I'm going to share with you 2 quotes of what we heard from members in focus groups. We feel unseen. We feel unheard. We are subject to physical violence and verbal threats on a daily basis. We're dealing with psychological issues. We don't feel safe. We are frustrated and experiencing high burnout. There are days I look to the local grocery store as an appealing option because of the daily gruel of my job. Another member said, who is going to want to do a job where you're going to be kicked and punched and not believed and shamed and subject to verbal abuse with no recourse? We've all been set up to fail by a system that is not fit for purpose when it comes to preventing abuse. I'm going to pass the mic back over, but what I want to leave you with is our students deserve a high-quality education, and that is what our professionals in school buildings have set out to provide. They cannot do that if they cannot ensure safe learning and working environments for everyone involved. All it takes is one incident in a classroom or a school to disrupt learning for the entire school population. It doesn't have to be like this. There are solutions. Karen is going to provide those solutions for you in just a moment, but I also want to turn it over to a member to tell you about her experiences in her own words. So Carlin Palmby, an educational assistant with Ontario Schools, is now going to speak about her experiences.
Good morning, everyone. This is my first time speaking at Queen's Park Media Studio, so thank you for having me. When I was asked to speak today, I sat down with one of my sisters who works in the corporate world, and I told her I had no idea what I would say. I worried that I have no dramatic stories. I have had no life-altering injuries, unlike so many of my colleagues, and how could I possibly represent them? How could I possibly share anything that would resonate with people who don't know the world that I work in? And my sister looked at me like I had 10 heads. She pointed out how many family functions I have come to in the past few years with bite marks, bruises, and black eyes. She reminded me of the times that I've had chairs thrown at me and hair ripped from my head. And I realized that the fact that I think those situations aren't dramatic or traumatic is a symptom of just how broken the system has gotten. Because to me, that's just a regular Tuesday. To me, it is completely normal to walk into the classroom every morning and have to redress in full protective equipment. My hair is tied back and I wear no jewelry, not even my wedding ring. I carry a walkie-talkie at all times. I put on leg guards and then arm guards. I pull on a jacket that is fitted with plates that cover my entire upper body. And then I will struggle to pull on gloves that have rubber over the lengths of my fingers and the backs of my hands. I will boil in these layers of high-impact foam and rubber all day as I support a student through academic tasks, gym, recess, toileting, and through the inevitable spurts of physical aggression that will flare up out of frustration when the iPad dies or we're out of oranges, or more often than not, because the world's not built for his needs. In those moments where his feelings are too big for him to contain, my suit of armor will protect me, but it will also allow me to protect him and his 20 classmates. I am just one of 16 educational assistants, or EAs, at my elementary school of 365 kids in a quiet little tourist town in southwestern Ontario. Us 16 EAs have together written more than 170 violent incident reports this school year alone, which quite honestly is less than a third of the real number because we just don't have time in our day to fill out the exhaustive paperwork. The adults in my school building, the teachers, educational assistants, early childhood educators, and child and youth workers who pour their heart and souls into supporting and nurturing the tiny humans who walk into that school building every day, every single one of them does it for love of the job. But we can only keep that love for so long. Over the past few years, I have watched some of my most passionate and compassionate colleagues leave the field entirely, because you can only work so many extra jobs to supplement the relatively low wages of being an education worker, especially as a parent. You can only take so many beatings, and you can only take so much disrespect from this provincial government. I have been an educational assistant for 12 years, and I used to be really proud of that. I am the only public service worker in my family, and it was such a point of pride, the work that I get to do, the lives I get to impact, and the incredible little miracles I get to witness every day. And don't get me wrong, I still love my job. I am reminded daily by the student I support that I am so incredibly blessed to get to be a part of his development. But that pride has diminished every time Doug Ford and the Progressive Conservative Party have deliberately left our children underfunded and our support staff undervalued. I can't say that when I started with the Liberals it was rainbows and sunshine, but it wasn't this. It wasn't our walkie-talkies going off with a crisis call multiple times a day because a desk is being thrown across the room. It wasn't walking into the staff room to find a colleague in tears with bruises around her neck. It wasn't coming to school praying that today isn't the day you get a concussion or worse because you have to work your second job tonight, and if you get hurt, who is going to feed and care for your children? It doesn't need to be this way. If this government spent as much effort addressing the mental health and staffing crises happening in our schools as they have getting booze into our corner stores, we'd for sure have safer schools with properly funded supports by this fall too. Thank you.
I don't know how you listen to that and not tear up. I wish I could say that's the only story like that in the province. But I've been a teacher since 1991, and these stories are so common and so prevalent in our system. We are in a crisis situation, and we have to do something. Every morning, our dedicated education workers and teachers step into Ontario schools, driven by the passion that Carlin mentioned to inspire young minds. But instead of focusing on fostering creativity and curiosity, they're forced to navigate workplaces with increasing intimidation, threats, and even physical harm. It's a heartbreaking reality that no education worker or student should ever have to endure. Please don't forget the students in all of this. Our schools are still safe places for learning and growth. Education workers and teachers are dedicated professionals who work tirelessly to provide a nurturing environment for our students. In fact, I was recently at a professional learning opportunity with an educational assistant who said, "I got to get ready for tomorrow because I'm going to go back and get beat up." And she just mentioned it like that. Like this is a normal thing and this is expected. Violence should never be expected in any workplace, especially in a province as prosperous as Ontario. It's crucial that we acknowledge the challenges they face and work together to address them. And that's why we are calling on urgent action on the part of the Ford government. We know that cuts to core education funding and the lack of resources and accountability is fueling the rise in violence. But this is not a problem without a solution. For those of you who know me, I like to come up with a solution, and we've worked really hard to come up with some viable options and solutions. We refuse to accept violence as an inevitable part of our schools. We refuse to stand idly by while the safety and well-being of staff and students are compromised. OSSTF FEESO is calling on the Ford government to work with us and other teacher unions to implement the following 4 proposed solutions to stop the rise of violence in Ontario schools. We need emergency safe school funding. You know, you'll say, oh, you just want more money? No, this money already exists in a planning provision funding, which is kind of like a secret contingency account that the government could access, that they could implement. It stands at $1.39 billion. They could create an emergency safe school fund to bring in more qualified staff. In fact, I asked Carlin, when you were here today, is there somebody coming in to fill in for you? And thankfully there were, because across the province, that's not the case. We need to have professional support, student support personnel, education assistants, and other education workers working with the students of the province. We need a stay and learn program, and that's for adults who can provide those supports to students. There should be a dedicated tuition waiver to attract students into education programs for occupations experiencing shortages, such as educational assistants and professional student support personnel, or PSSPs. Similar programs have been introduced in healthcare and long-term care and are supported by this provincial government. So why aren't you supporting the students of the province? Release the data now. OSSTF demands that the Ford government release the data on the serious student incident reports, risk assessments, and the Ministry of Labor's Workplace Violence Inspection Blitz of education work sites that was conducted in February and March of 2023. It's over a year ago. And a safe school action table. OSSTF FEESO calls on the government to commit to the development of a safe school action plan with a community and stakeholder action table that will include OSSTF FEESO and other education unions. I hear about consulting from the government, and nobody's ringing my number. We urge the government to make schools safer by investing in public education and much-needed classroom supports and resources that will keep both students and staff safe. Education workers deserve to feel safe in their workplaces. Students deserve to learn and thrive in an environment free from fear. This is not about protecting the present, it's about safeguarding the future of our education system. And I will now take any questions.
Karen, you said that you were a teacher since 1991, so maybe you can speak to this. You're talking about violence, lack of discipline, a rise in psychological issues. And I was wondering if you have noticed that there might be a broader change in culture and society that could also explain these issues and may not simply be jurisdictional.
Yeah, no, absolutely. 1991 is a long time ago. It was a different century, in fact, but things really have changed since then. And that's what we're finding is that commitment and supports, and you can blame the pandemic for all sorts of things. I want to point out that we are going to have a crisis again this fall when we're calling them the COVID babies enter school. This will be a population of students who haven't had that ability to socialize or to be able to have what other students have had. And if we're looking at the issues in education now, what's going to happen if the COVID babies don't get the supports they need in the form of early intervention? I really think it's that attitude. But I also, when I started teaching in 1991 in York Region in an elementary school, we had a full-time guidance counselor. And you'd say, why would you have a guidance counselor? You're not picking your course selection. No, we had a guidance counselor to meet the needs of the students and to run social groups and to provide those supports right in our school every day. And right now, the high school that I'm attached to in Alliston, I'm not there because I'm doing this job. I think they get a child and youth worker a day a week. So the attitude, I think, has changed, though, in the supports that are being provided because school boards have to make really tough decisions on where they're going to put their money.
Juste une question en français.
Oui.
Peut-être nous parler Est-ce que le niveau de violence, ça a un impact sur le recrutement après, puis sur les,
Oui.
les carrières qui sont peut-être écourtées, puis des gens qui décident de quitter le milieu?
Oui, oui, on a beaucoup de gens qui décident de quitter les milieux, mais aussi on a des élèves qui sont dans la faculty d'education, qui entrent, qui vont faire le practicum et ils disent je ne veux pas le faire. C'est pas pour moi. C'est pas ce que j'ai pensé une carrière en éducation serait. C'est vraiment différent et sans support, non, on va travailler quelque part d'autre.
Puis, quel serait votre message, justement, pour les gens qui considèrent une carrière en éducation avec les données que vous venez de nous présenter?
Oui, on aura un grand problème parce que, oui, je viens d'enseigner en 1991. Je peux prendre ma retraite maintenant. On a un grand nombre de personnes qui peuvent le faire. Qui va continuer dans l'éducation? Qui va continuer dans l'administration d'être les principals, vice principals? On n'a pas assez de gens qui vont prendre les cours. Et la solution du ministère de l'Éducation, c'est d'embaucher encore les personnes qui ont pris leur retraite. C'est bizarre pour moi. Il faut avoir une profession qui est valorisée, qui attire beaucoup de gens dans la profession, et ça n'arrive pas en Ontario maintenant.
Karen, you mentioned contingency funding. Is that within the education budget itself, or are you talking about the larger?
Yeah, no, within the education budget, it's just, this little kind of secret little fund that is growing and could be spent, and where we could be looking at making sure that we have the individuals to fill those jobs. There are a lot of people. We have about 3,000 PSSP members, personal student support personnel, and professional student support personnel, and many of them are also working in private practice or leaving for private practice because of the conditions in education, because of Bill 124 and the 1% cap on wages. And people are looking somewhere else where they're going to be respected, but also where they're not going to have to wear full PPE every day to go to work to support the students of the province.
And just on that, on the PPE, I'm wondering if you can speak to, is this something that is commonly used by education workers?
Yeah.
Or are these kind of maybe one-off?
It's totally commonly used to the effect that we have schools with, in the closet. So when the supply EA comes in or the supply teacher comes in, they can find which size fits them. There are so many schools where that's part of the job, is getting in time to be able to put on full protective gear, face, head. They disguise the helmets that are worn by people to make it look like a ball cap, but you're wearing elbow pads, shoulder pads, Kevlar, the full-on total protection, and it's so common. We try to say, and it's true, that the system is safe. We try to not highlight, and that's why Carlin, everything's fine, and I don't have that rough of a job. We minimize that because we care about the students and because we want to do the best for the students in the province. So nobody's advertising that. Nobody's taking pictures of people in their personal protective equipment. We actually, in one of our professional magazines a few years ago, Education Forum, we did publish a story about it, and we showed that personal protective equipment, and people say, well, that's not really happening, or it's just in special education classes. Absolutely not. I'm not putting the burden on students who have other needs. This is throughout the whole system. This type of protection is necessary so workers can go home safe to their families.
Maybe from your perspective, I was wondering if we take away your job as an EA and what you're telling us about how you prepare when you go to work, it sounds like you're going to prison.
Do you want to
talk about that a little bit? How you feel about when you're preparing to go to work?
Yeah, and also to the how much is this happening? I work in a grade 2-3 classroom, and 2 out of the 3 EAs in our classroom are in full head to toe. In fact, I don't wear we call them bump caps now. I don't wear one because it actually upsets the student that I work with, but the other EA in my classroom does. So we are 2 out of the 3 of us are head to toe. It's hard. It is hard to come in every day and At one point when I asked what to wear today, it was like, oh, just dress like you do. And I was like, oh, you don't want that. Like I'm in leggings and, a dirty shirt because I'm going to spend the entire day zipped up in several layers of this foam and rubber. And, it's hot, it's gross, it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable physically. It's also emotionally uncomfortable to be in it, for sure. It's nobody's first choice.
Do you have AC in your class?
Thank goodness I do. We are one of a very lucky building that does have air conditioning. I don't know how I would function without it. Yeah.
Just a question on the survey itself. Was this an opt-in for members?
Dawn can probably elaborate on that.
It was, but it was sent to the entire membership population. So it still had a strong response rate, and I'll get you the exact sample size. We had 6,585 members.
And I guess just on that, do you think that's kind of representative
Yes.
of the membership?
The data is weighted on the back end to ensure it's representative by job function and region to control for those factors as much as possible. But we also had a strong response rate, right? So 6,585 members participated, which I think tells you something just about the seriousness and the relevance of the issue in and of itself.
Do you have that as a percentage, of how many you actually sent the...
Yeah, it was sent to, I think I have, let me just check another memo I have up here with me. It was sent to 41,000 members. So it's a completion rate of 16%.
Yeah, but that's a good question. Do you not think that this might be just the people that actually feel like they have something to say and to complain about?
I think that based on decades of experience in the public schools and their own experiences speaking with members regularly, the strength of the data, the number of completes, focus groups, and many years of research that they have conducted on a host of topics, we feel quite confident in the data.
Just add 2 points that I would add. When this data was shared last fall with our leadership at a provincial meeting, there was nobody who said, well, this is not accurate. In fact, they all kind of went, yeah, we know this. It's absolutely. And I would challenge you to find a single person working in a public school in Ontario who says, I've never seen an act of violence or heard an act of violence, or somebody working in education who doesn't know that there are people in their board, maybe not at their school, but probably at their school, wearing some form of protective equipment.